What I'm hoping is that this evening I will be able to share with you some of my favourite places and what it is that has really captivated me about this region. I want to draw you in to the locations and the cultures and the people in the hope that it will inspire you to have your own adventure in Central Asia and to travel with Intriq Journey next year. Large part of this talk is going to be a crash course in the history and the geography of the Silk Road. My focus is going to be in particular on Central Asia, the heart of the Silk Road, because this is the place where you will find the bejewelled mosques, the madrasas and mausoleums. It's the place of camel caravans crossing the deserts and the steppe, of exotic bazaars with silks and ceramics and spices. It's a region which really epitomises the romantic idea of the Silk Road and has inspired numerous travel accounts and fairy tales, not least 1001 Nights, where Shah Jahan is the Sultan of Samarkand. I'm going to start with a slight orientation on the ancient Silk Road, because it's a name that many of us are familiar with, but the exact details of it may be not so familiar. The first thing I should say is that Silk Road, and indeed the labelling on this map, is a misnomer. It shouldn't be Silk Road at all. It should be roads in the plural, because there was not one road, but many. Some of the larger routes are shown on this map here, and you can see the general movement between east and west, west and east. But there was also a much wider network of smaller routes connected with this. There was a crisscross of trading routes across Persia and the Caucasus, north across the Great Eurasian Steppe up into Russia, south through Pakistan, also Afghanistan, Pakistan, and down into India and the rest of the Indian subcontinent. But whichever way you look at this network of routes, you see that Central Asia is very much in the geographical centre. It is a hub from which spokes stretched out in every direction. The physical geography of Central Asia very much dictated where the trading routes went. You can see here a picture of the Tian Shan Mountains as they appear in Kyrgyzstan, and there are huge mountain ranges all across the eastern parts of Central Asia. We have the Pamir, the Hindu Kush, the Alai, and the western Tian Shan, and as you can see, they are in many places impenetrable. The trading routes, the routes along which people could travel, were those along river valleys and over passes. The same is true of the deserts and the steppe. You had to travel along where there was going to be a watercourse of some kind, be it a river, be it an oasis. And so the geography dictated where the routes would lie. The largest and most populous cities in Central Asia grew up at the crossroads, in oases and along river banks. These were the natural locations for development. I want to take you back, though, a little further away in history, before the Silk Road as we know it began. There were many millennia of migration into Central Asia before what we know as the Silk Road. There were waves of migration from Siberia and the Altai to the north, but also from Persia, the area around modern-day Iran. We know some of the earliest evidence of human inhabitation in these areas is in the form of petroglyphs, these rock carvings and paintings, which are widely spread across the region. Some of them are as much as 10,000 years old, and they have protected monument status. Those in Tamgali in Kazakhstan, which you can see in the bottom right here, have UNESCO World Heritage status, signifying their importance to global culture. It's quite hard to imagine what was going on in the world when these were painted, but we can say 10,000 years ago approximately was when humans first domesticated cattle and when there was the first cultivation of wheat and barley. So we're talking about the dawn of civilization. The petroglyphs in Central Asia give an indication of why populations settled, well, not necessarily settled, but spent time in particular locations in the course of their migrations. We can see in these paintings the big game, particularly the deer, wild cattle and goats, and even, in the case in the top right, an elephant, certainly not an animal that we would associate with Central Asia today. There are also a lot of stickmen in these paintings, often with spears or with bows and arrows. These are hunters, and there are also scenes of the hunters celebrating the successes of their hunt. They're dancing and they're partying. What this shows us was that these areas were very rich hunting grounds. It also suggests that the climate, the ecosystem, and the kind of wildlife living in these areas is very different today than it was 10,000 years ago. There seems to be, today there seems to be that the land is much drier, that there is much less vegetation, and consequently much less wildlife. This is not just that it has been overhunted, because in large parts of Central Asia, the population, the human population, is still quite sparse, but rather that the climate has changed and many of those species have died out. The first settled population, so to date I have been talking about those who were migrants. The first settled population in Central Asia is thought to have come in the first millennium BC, and it's the Bactria-Margiana archaeological complex, nicknamed BMAC. And the BMAC civilization grew up around 2400 BC. It's a Bronze Age civilization, roughly contemporary to the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt. Now, BMAC is also known as the Oxus civilization because it was centered on the river Oxus, known today as the Amudarya, and this is the dominant river in Central Asia. The population, marked in orange on the map here, would have been centered on what is now Uzbekistan and parts of Tajikistan, but also in northern Afghanistan and parts of Turkmenistan too. It seems that the BMAC people settled here because of the water supply, because there were fertile lands which they could farm, and because it was away from the extreme weather and environment of the high mountains and the desert. It was a relatively easy place to live and a place where they could thrive. The fascinating thing about the BMAC civilization in Central Asia is that they weren't just subsisting. These weren't people who were scraping a living, they really were thriving. The civilization was successful enough that there was surplus wealth and surplus manpower in society. And this supported the development of artisans and a priestly class within the community. Here we have an example of a Bactrian princess, a statue made sometime in the 3rd or the 2nd millennium BC. This particular example is in the Louvre Museum in France, but there are in fact a number of these statues found in BMAC sites across the region. So it wasn't just a case of one artisan making statues like this. There would have been numerous workshops, and this would have been a popular form of art to have, perhaps in the home of a wealthy person, perhaps in a temple. What we know is that the BMAC people, in addition to producing artworks like this, also started constructing megaliths, ritual sites, places of worship. Megaliths are rock structures and they're found around the world. Two of the most famous examples would be Stonehenge in Britain and also Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. Megaliths are sacred places with a ritual function. A small number of these were discovered in Central Asia, particularly in the Fergana Valley, by archaeologists in the 1990s. They date from the 1st millennium BC, the Iron Age, and are roughly contemporary with the Neo-Assyrian Empire in Persia. What's really exciting for me, however, is that an archaeological survey last year, so only in 2020, in the Fergana Valley, has found more than 200 of these sites. So we went from perhaps less than a dozen being known in the 1990s to now knowing that there are more than 200. 50 of these are in a single valley, which has been nicknamed the Valley of Kings. The huge number and concentration of these megalithic sites in the Fergana Valley suggests that there was an extensive and previously unknown megalithic civilization in Central Asia. To give you a rough idea of the dating of these sites, we're talking about 200 years before the foundation of the Roman city of Carthage. So these are not just piles of rocks, contrary to how it may have looked in some of those photographs. If we take an aerial view, and this is one of the archaeologists' sketches, diagram that they produced of some of the sites last year, we can see when we look at them from above that the stones have been very deliberately placed. This shows us that the people who made them had an understanding of geometry and of astronomy. And I say astronomy because many of the rocks have been aligned with astronomic events, such as the solstice and the equinox, and they've also been aligned with constellations. So in this way, we can see a similarity with the Stonehenge site in England. The site on the bottom right with the 3 concentric circles is believed to have been some sort of observatory. And yes, there was a scientific reason for this, but also a religious one. It is believed that the soul of a deceased person should pass through the multiple rings, and when it enters the centre of the circle, would be able to transcend to the heavens. I get really, really excited when I see sites like this, because it shows already a very sophisticated kind of civilization in Central Asia. 3,000 years ago, there were people in the Fergana Valley who were astronomers. They were already mapping the stars and gazing at the heavens and wondering what they meant. By the 6th century BC, so now we're talking about 100 years before the death of Confucius, there was another civilization rising in Central Asia, and one which is much more famous. It was the Sogdians. These people were merchants primarily, and they founded city-states across Central Asia. Most importantly for our talk today, however, they were also the pioneers of the Silk Road, the first to build long-distance cultural and diplomatic links and to trade extensively with those around them. The Sogdians were already fairly well established in Central Asia by the 6th century BC. And although other empires came and went, there was a significant Sogdian presence in Central Asia for 1,300 years, right up until the time of the Arab conquest in the 8th century AD. Two of the most important Sogdian cities in Central Asia were ancient Penjikent, which is in the northwest of Tajikistan, and Afrasiab, which is near to Samarkand in Uzbekistan. These two cities were founded roughly contemporary with the Warring States period in China, and if we're looking at Middle Eastern history, with the construction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. Both Penjkent and Afrasiab have been extensively excavated by archaeologists, and indeed digging is ongoing in Penjkent, where it is led by archaeologists from the State Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. The Sogdians were known for their murals, and many of these exquisite artworks have been excavated from sites like Penjkent and Afrasiab. The finest examples have been taken to museums. Some are in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, but importantly for tourists who are considering visiting Central Asia, there are also many in local collections. So if you go, for example, to the National Museum or the Museum of Antiquities in Dushanbe, you will see the paintings from Penjkent. There are also Penjkent murals in the local Rudaki Museum close to the archaeological site. And the same is true in Uzbekistan. If you want to see the murals from Afrasiab, you can go to the Afrasiab Museum in Samarkand and see the originals there. This is one of the murals from Afrasiab, which is in the Afrasiab Museum, and it shows a funeral procession. At the front of the procession is the king, who is leading the procession of his predecessor. And it is a whole series of paintings which would have surrounded all the wall of a room in the house of a wealthy, powerful individual within the community. And I'm going to talk you briefly through a few of these pictures. Here we have two of the Turkish officers who would have come to watch the funeral procession to pay their respects. You can see their hairstyles, you can see the costumes, and you can see the accessories that they're wearing. And this is something which makes the paintings an invaluable primary resource for historians studying the Sogdian period. In another scene, as we have here, there's a Sogdian interpreter in the middle, and he's talking to the Tibetan messengers and translating what they have to say for the Sogdian courtiers. The fabulous thing about these paintings is that they demonstrate to us the extent of the Sogdians' trading and diplomatic ties. They show us that cities like Penjikent and Afrasiab would have been incredibly cosmopolitan, with populations from all across the known world who came here to trade and to share knowledge, to meet with the political figures. So they really were hubs of international civilization and exchange. Where there is wealth and power, however, there is always going to be envy. And the Sogdian city-states were certainly targets for conquerors. Throughout the 1300-year period when the Sogdians were influential in Central Asia, they were attacked on numerous occasions by some of history's most famous figures. On the left, we have Cyrus the Great, who conquered Afrasiab. Darius the Great, another great Persian, made Afrasiab his capital, capital of the satrapy of Sogdia, so the province of Sogdia, which was under his empire. And then on the right, the figure you're probably most famous with, Alexander the Great. He conquered Afrasiab in 329 BC, and it made it his base for all of his expeditions within Transoxiana, the land between the Oxus. Alexander was not only a great warrior, but he was also a great builder, and he built cities all across his empire, including in Central Asia. Most of them, he was very imaginative in the naming, he called them Alexandria. And Ptolemy, the Greek historian and chronicler, recorded each of these Alexandria cities in his records. The location of one of these cities, Alexandria on the Oxus, was, until very, very recently, somewhat of a mystery. Ptolemy had written about it, he had described its location and its features, but the city seemed to have completely disappeared. Archaeologists had a number of theories as to where it might be, including in what is now Temiz in southern Uzbekistan and Canoe in northern Afghanistan, but there was no certainty. However, in 2019, Edvard Repfladze, archaeologist who had been working at the Kampir Tepe site in southern Uzbekistan, I think for about 30 years by this point, decided that he had enough evidence to prove that Kampir Tepe was in fact the city of Alexandria on the Oxus as described by Ptolemy. The dating of the site to around 328 BC is exactly contemporaneous with Alexander's expeditions in Central Asia. One of the gateways is an exact copy of one which Alexander conquered in modern Turkey. There were coins found at the site with the correct dating and also evidence as a port. This was something quite surprising to the archaeologists because today the river is quite some distance from the ruins of Kampir Tepe or Alexandria on the Oxus. And what they realised is the reason that they had struggled to identify it initially is that although the name Alexandria on the Oxus suggests the city was built on the riverbank, in the intervening millennia, the river has changed its course. So Alexandria on the Oxus would originally have been on the river, but now the river has moved. And if you look at this picture, It is on the far side of the green floodplain that you can see. Links between the ancient Greeks and Bactria, this part of Central Asia, endured after Alexander the Great's death. They continued to influence art and costume, coinage, religion, and even architecture and urban planning. The Sogdians managed to keep open the trade routes, and it wasn't until the 8th century and the Arab invasion that there was a significant cultural change in the region. When the Arabs came, it strengthened ties to the West, including to the Byzantine Empire and to the Middle East. There was a new focus on this geographical direction, but also a new religion, Islam. And this changed the cultural direction of Central Asia right through to the present day. One of the sites which epitomizes this is Merv, which is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site in Turkmenistan. In the 9th century, Merv became the capital of the Islamic Caliphate, and then, a few centuries later, the capital of the Seljuk Empire. The Seljuks were Turco-Persian Sunni Muslims, and at the time of the First and Second Crusade in the West, their empire was so broad that it stretched all the way from the Holy Land to the borders with China. It's estimated that at its height, Merv had a population of some 500,000 people, 500,000, and this earned the city the nickname Mother of the World. And indeed, it is probably, if not the largest city, certainly one of the largest cities of the medieval world. The only cities which might have rivaled it in size were Kaifend in China, Constantinople, and Baghdad in what is now Iraq. It would have been an extraordinary sight. The reason it, unlike the names of Constantinople and Baghdad, you may not be familiar with Merv today, is that the city was almost completely destroyed by Genghis Khan in 1221. It was one of history's bloodiest genocides, and it is estimated that possibly as many as 1 million people were killed. Half of these would have been the inhabitants of Merv, and the other half would have been refugees from other parts of Central Asia who had fled to Merv, hoping to find safety and keeping ahead of Genghis Khan's Mongol troops. Unfortunately, Merv and its population never recovered. There was some fear that Central Asia would descend into a dark age in the 13th century, but whilst some cities such as Merv were completely destroyed, others managed to hang on. And because there was still a need for trade, and because the Pax Mongolica, the peace ultimately created by the Mongols, did enable movement of people and goods across the Mongol Empire, there was steadily recovery. This is a picture of Merv as it is today. And you can see there is very little left of what would have been one of the greatest cities on earth. Within 150 years of the desecration by the Mongols, however, Central Asia had another, almost as infamous ruler. His name was Amir Timur, although in the West he is better known as Tamerlane. You would never have dared to call Timur Tamerlane to his face, however, because it is a corruption of Timur I Lem, which means Timur the Lame. It is, so this was an insult that his enemies would have used to describe him, but it seems that it is actually accurate, because when archaeologists excavated his body in the 20th century, they did find damage to the skeleton, suggesting some sort of childhood injury, and he would have walked with a limp throughout his life. Amir Timur was arguably one of the most important figures in Central Asian history, possibly in the past 1,000 years. His rule, if you're looking to put him into international historical context, his rule overlaps with the early Ming dynasty in China and with the Plantagenet kings of England. It is said that he was born clasping a clot of blood in his hand, which would be a portent for things to come. Like Genghis Khan, Amir Timur set out creating an extraordinary empire. He saw himself as a successor to Genghis Khan. He wasn't a biological descendant, but he felt that Genghis Khan's empire had more potential than it has been able to realise during Genghis Khan's lifetime. And so his plan was to extend and to model himself on Genghis Khan and to create a new and arguably better empire than Genghis Khan had managed. Amir Timur was certainly very violent on the battlefield, very successful on the battlefield. It is said that he created pyramids of skulls in Herat, in Isfahan, in Delhi and Baghdad. His brutality is something that we cannot escape from. It put fear into those around him, but it did make him very, very successful as a military leader. And ultimately, his empire stretched from what is now Turkey in the west, south to the Persian Gulf, and east all of the way to Delhi, as well as across Central Asia into sort of what is now a central part of Kazakhstan. I mentioned Amir Timur's brutality, but where he differed from Genghis Khan is he was also a fine administrator and a patron of the arts. And it is him we have to thank for a lot of the cities that we see in Central Asia today and for the monuments which make them so extraordinary. So there is a dichotomy between his violence and brutality and the creative cultural renaissance that he led in Central Asia. Amir Timur was born in Shahrisabz in Uzbekistan, but he made his capital in Samarkand. Samarkand had always been the regional centre of power. I mentioned Afrasiab earlier, and it had continued to grow and flourish and somehow survived destruction by Genghis Khan. What Timur did is he brought the finest architects, engineers and artisans from all over his empire to Samarkand, and with them he built the monuments. He wanted a city that would reflect his power and reflect his cosmopolitanism. And so we see features in the city that you would otherwise associate with Iran, with Afghanistan and India. And it's because he brought the greatest minds and the greatest creative forces to Samarkand to make it a truly extraordinary place. The photos that you can see on the screen right now are all from the Shahizinda, which is one of the most remarkable UNESCO World Heritage Sites in Samarkand. There had been a tomb in the Shahizinda for a number of centuries already, which belonged to Qusam ibn Abbas, who is believed to be a cousin of the Prophet Muhammad, and this made it a pilgrimage place. But during Timur's reign, he expanded the complex considerably, and he turned it into a royal necropolis. So many members of Timur's family, in particular female members of the family, his mother, his sisters, his wives, so on and so forth, are buried here in what is one of the most beautiful places you will ever visit. Another great monument in Samarkand from Timur's rule is the Bibi Canoe Mosque, which is said to have been built in honour of his wife. The architect who designed this building was from Iran, and the building was paid for with the spoils of his battles in Delhi. It wasn't just money that he brought back from India. He also imported 95 elephants, and he used them to do the heavy lifting when the mosque was being constructed. It was the largest mosque in Central Asia when it was built, although it seems to have been built too fast and too large. And so cracks soon began to appear in the building. And what you see today is largely a reconstruction because the building was in a state of collapse and had to be rebuilt. This building here is the Guri Amir, which is Amir Timur's own mausoleum in Samarkand. It was originally built by Timur for his grandson, Muhammad Sultan, who sadly predeceased Timur. But when Timur died on campaign in China in 1405, his death was quite sudden and unexpected. It was also in the winter, and it was not possible to carry his body over the snowbound pass between Samarkand and Shahrazabs, the place of his birth, and so he was buried in Samarkand instead. If you see his tomb inside the complex, there is some rather sinister wording on it. It says, "Whoever opens my tomb shall unleash an invader more terrible than I." Many people have believed that Timur's grave is cursed, and there is some anecdotal evidence to suggest that is true. On the 20th of June 1941, Soviet archaeologists exhumed his body from the grave. 2 days later, Hitler invaded the USSR in Operation Barbarossa, and there are those who say that it was Timur's wrath that brought this tragedy to Russia. Stalin himself is said to have believed that the curse might have some truth in it and ordered the body to be returned to its grave. Timur's successors include the Mughal Dynasty, which many of you will be familiar with in India. And it is thought that the Guri Amir in Samarkand was an archaeological model, an architectural model for all of the garden tombs that we see in South Asia, most notably Babur's tomb in Kabul, Humayun's tomb in Delhi, and the Taj Mahal in Agra. The most famous of Uzbekistan's monuments in Samarkand is one that I haven't yet mentioned. It's the Registan, which means a sandy place, and it was always Samarkand's central square. This is the place which was considered to be the hub of the Timurid Renaissance. The reason I hadn't mentioned it before is that the madrasas you see today were actually built after Timur's death. The oldest of the madrasas is the one on the left-hand side, Ulugbeg Madrasa, which dates from 1470 to 20. Ulugbeg was Amir Timur's grandson, and he is better known as the astronomer king. Indeed, he wasn't much better as a ruler. He was much better as a mathematician and a scientist, and this is what we celebrate him for. On the portico of his madrasa, there are tiles, which is a nod to his passion for astronomy. Here we have Ulugbeg and an illustration of part of his observatory. And for me, Ulugbeg and his observatory really symbolise the exchange of ideas along the Silk Road. This is a man who was born in northwest Iran, who travelled extensively in the Middle East and the Caucasus and in India, but settled and died in Samarkand. Ulugbeg spoke 5 languages, including his own Turkic language, Arabic, Persian, and some Chinese. He had an extensive library of manuscripts in all of these languages, brought from all parts of the Timurid Empire, and he engaged actively with visiting scholars, including those from Iran, Afghanistan, Azerbaijan, and Turkey. Ulugbeg's observatory was built in the 1420s. This is a modern reconstruction of one of the buildings on the site. The observatory was considered to be the finest in the Islamic world, and it was certainly befitting of the 15th century's greatest astronomer. Given the time period that we're talking about, Ulugbeg didn't have access to the modern kinds of telescopes that we would use today, but he did construct huge measuring instruments, such as this meridian arc. The design of this arc is similar to those used by Tycho Brahe in Scandinavia and by Taqi el-Din, the great Turkish astronomer. The star catalogue that Ulugbeg was able to produce with these instruments included 1,018 stars. He was able to correct the errors made by Ptolemy and by the great Arabian astronomers, and his star catalogue was still in use at Oxford University in the 1600s. Ulugbeg was able to accurately calculate the length of the sidereal and tropical years, the axial tilt of the Earth. His astronomical discoveries are considered so important that a moon crater was named after him, and also an asteroid. In spite of his achievements, sadly, Ulugh had rather a grisly end. He fell out with his son, and whilst he was on pilgrimage to Mecca in 1449, his son had him assassinated. So a rather ignominious end to a rather extraordinary person. The Silk Road, thanks to the Timurids, really was a conduit and a crucible for scientific research and the arts. It was not just goods which were travelling all along the Silk Roads, but it was also people, ideas, and new ways of doing things. The knowledge and the research capacity became concentrated in madrasas. The word madrasa is often translated as Islamic school, but it's far more than that. It really was a university, an institution offering a very broad and deep education, of which theology was a component. The best comparison really would be with the colleges of Oxford and Cambridge, which also were thriving in the medieval period. And again, there they offered a religious education as well as a secular one. And the breadth of the curriculum there would certainly be comparable with that in the madrasas. The particular madrasa you see here is within the Hisor fort complex in Western Tajikistan, but there are madrasas all across Central Asia. I think probably the most impressive of the surviving madrasas is the Mir E Arab Madrasa in Bukhara. Mir E Arab means Prince of the Arabs, and it is named for its benefactor, Sheikh Abdullah Yemeni, who built the madrasa in 1535 to 1536. It is said that he paid for the madrasa with the proceeds from the sale of 3,000 Persian slaves. The Mir E Arab was very much a centre of Islamic learning, renowned across the Islamic world. Most interesting for me, however, it was the only madrasa in the former Soviet, in the Soviet Union. It was the only madrasa which was allowed to continue operating. All of the other madrasas were closed. Many of them were converted into community centres, into warehouses, factories, or simply used as historic sites. But the Mir E Arab continued as a place of learning throughout the 20th century and to the present day. There are today, I think, 56 students still studying at the Mir E Arab, and tuition, should you wish to study there, is about $800 per year. On many of the buildings that I have shown you so far, you will have admired the extraordinary facades which demonstrate the great achievements in applied arts in Central Asia. There are, of course, the majolica and mosaic tiles, but there is also the wood carving, painting, metalwork, and decorative plasterwork known as ganch. Many of these traditional skills were maintained throughout the Soviet period, along with a fashion for decorating public buildings. These particular mosaics are on the end of a mixture of public buildings and apartment blocks in Dushanbe, the capital of Tajikistan. And here we have some sublime stained glass from the Kazakh Academy of Sciences in Almaty. I think probably the most famous example of application of the applied arts in the Soviet period, however, is the Tashkent Metro, which was built in the 1970s when the city was rebuilt following a catastrophic earthquake. Each of the cities on the main line, each of the stations on the main lines were designed by different architects and artists. One of my favourites is Cosmonaut Station, which you see here. It's space themed and it really does have the feel of being a sci-fi movie set. There are portraits throughout the station of the most important astronauts in the Soviet space program. There is, of course, Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space, who went up in 1961. But also in this particular picture here, we have Valentina Tereshkova, who was the first woman in space. She went up in 1963, and I think she's a fantastic character, and I wish she was more widely known. She was working in a textile factory before she became an astronaut, but she had a weekend hobby. She was an amateur skydiver. And this is what set her apart from the other candidates when she applied for the space programme. They thought, she's the kind of girl we need, and she was chosen and trained. She is, to date, the only woman to complete a solo space mission, and she retired as a Major General in the Russian Air Force in 1997. Today, she's a member of the State Duma, the Russian Parliament, so she really has had quite a remarkable career. The Cosmonaut Station was built at the height of the space race during the Cold War, and Central Asia played a key role in the USSR's space agenda. One of the reasons for this is that modern development in Central Asia had happened more or less on the same footprint as the Silk Road sites. This meant that human habitation was concentrated in relatively small areas, and there were large, quite empty spaces in between. The mountains and the deserts were ideal locations for observatories because the night sky was clear, there was no light pollution. The Chenshan Astronomical Observatory, which you see here, is still in use, and it is currently being upgraded and used in partnership with the South Korean Institute for Astronomy and Space Sciences. Here we have the Balak Observatory on the Moga Plateau, which is at a height of 4,350 meters. It's a high altitude desert, and this is important because in the dry atmosphere, there is much less water, much less moisture in the air, which could interfere with the light wavelengths. It's a perfect place for astronomic measurements. The observatory has been abandoned since Tajikistan had its independence, but I'm hoping that it's a site that will be rehabilitated in the future, partly for scientific research, but also as a centre for astrotourism. It's a fabulous place for stargazing. The USSR also launched its space missions from Central Asia, from the middle of the Kazakh steppe. Baikonur, the most famous cosmodrome, was originally built in 1955 as a test site for ICBMs, for intercontinental ballistic missiles, but it was then repurposed for space flights. All of the most important events in Soviet space history took place here, from the launch of Sputnik, the first satellite in 1957, to the first space flights by Yuri Gagarin and Valentina Tereshkova. Baikonur is still in active use today. Russia uses it as the launch pad for their missions to the International Space Station, and it's growing as a site for space tourism as well. You can go and do a tour of the Cosmodrome, you can watch a launch, and as space tourism grows in the future, it's likely that space tourists will fly from Baikonur as well. And I'm glad to tell you that if you are interested in space tourism, either going into space or more likely for now, touring the Cosmodrome, Intriq can arrange that for you. My final slide for you this evening is of the dark sky over Isyk in Kyrgyzstan. The Silk Road cities dazzle tourists by day, but by night, from Karakol, Pakistan in the west to the Pamir in the east, the heavens put on a show to rival anything that mankind has made. For more than 3,000 years, the people of Central Asia have looked to the stars, they've studied them, they've sought inspiration, and they've contemplated their place in the universe. When you travel to Central Asia, I think it's hugely important that you spend time appreciating this natural wonder, staring up at the heavens, and put yourself in situ, put yourself in context of the wonders of our universe. Thank you very much.